When I was Mormon, I fully believed in the doctrine of eternal celestial polygamy. And I believed in that doctrine as much as I believed that God was real, that Jesus Christ died on the cross. I believed that this doctrine was the gospel truth, essentially. And that was something that I had to contend with emotionally when I married my husband. Growing up in the church, I really believe there was a non-trivial chance that I would end up as a sister wife in heaven. I would go up into the sky after dying through the pearly gates and would be living in polygamy in heaven. If you ask a Mormon if they believe in polygamy, they'll say no. And they'll say, you know, back in the early days of the church, that was something that very few people did. And sure, it's maybe what we're associated with, but we don't practice polygamy. But they do practice polygamy in the afterlife. And this is not folklore. This is literally written in the church's handbook for bishops and stake presidents. And so this is enshrined not just in the Doctrine and Covenants, but also in current church teachings within the very official handbook, which is how we get stuff like this. This was recently posted on the ex-Mormon subreddit. I'll put it off to the side here. This is a woman who received this letter in March of 2025. So still going on here today. So it says, "Dear sister, blank," this is to a woman. "Your former husband, her ex, is applying to the first presidency for a sealing clearance." So she's being notified that her husband is attempting to marry a second person. So he's sealed to her. This is basically a notice that her husband is going to acquire a second wife. So your husband is applying for a sealing clearance. So think of that as a marriage. It says later on, "A sealing clearance, if approved, would allow your former husband to have another spouse sealed to him." Another spouse married to him. So this is a official Mormon document. This is an official notice from the church, essentially notifying her that she's about to become a sister wife. It goes on, however, it does not cancel your sealing to him. So they're making it blatantly clear. He is about to acquire a second wife, and when he acquires that second wife, it will not void or cancel out your marriage in heaven to him. So he's about to become a polygamist, and we just wanted to let you know with this document on our letterhead. And so as much as members would like to say, we got rid of polygamy in the late 1800s, which was more like the early 1900s, they still believe in polygamy today. It's just with an asterisk that it doesn't begin until the afterlife. I'll be reading a lot from this book today. It's called The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. It's by a woman named Carol Lynn Pearson. I'll link it below too because I found this book fascinating to read through. She gathered a lot of stories from individual people about how this doctrine, like I said, I personally believed that I might have to become a sister wife in heaven. So she compiled a lot of personal stories of how this impacted different people, whether it was people who were divorced or who had spouses pass away, whether it was people who had to confront this idea of living in polygamy someday or who are currently living in celestial polygamy and what that does to their psyche. And so we're definitely going to read some from that book. I'll be reading from Reddit threads and also just sharing stories I heard about polygamy growing up, people who were actively planning, who I knew personally, actively planning for what their polygamy was going to look like in heaven. To read from the introduction, she says, "Any member of the LDS or Mormon church today that enters the practice of polygamy is immediately excommunicated." True. So in real life, if you're a polygamist, you're excommunicated. But polygamy itself, the practice of polygamy, has never been excommunicated. It, being polygamy, is still a member in good standing, waiting on the other side to greet us in heaven and causing large injury here on earth. Polygamy delayed is still polygamy. And I'm going to read today from the official church handbook. This is a handbook specifically meant for bishops and stake presidents. Somebody leaked it to the public, but it's not meant for the general public to be able to read. I'll be reading from the church handbook where it explicitly explains that polygamy exists in heaven. And this is the form of polygamy where a man can have more than one wife, but a woman can only have one husband. Before we begin, don't forget to brew up your own cup of devil's bean juice. Cheers to all my sinners out there. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. I have a new video on Mormon doctrine, Mormon history, my experience in the church every single Friday. So don't forget to subscribe if you want to see that. To explain a little bit more in depth about this doctrine of sealings, it's sealing like you seal a jar, not sealing like above us. The way this works is that you have your civil marriage and you have your temple sealing. And these things are fundamentally different from each other. So you can be married civilly as a Mormon and not be sealed in the temple. And this happens, if somebody is, if two young people might enjoy each other a little too much and break the law of chastity, then they would have to be sealed in the temple at a later date, because they would have to first get married, then work with the bishop to overcome their sin, repent from their sin, and then later they'd be able to get sealed in the temple once the bishop says they repented thoroughly enough. So the temple sealing and the civil marriage exist separate from each other. The crazy part, though, is that the civil divorce and the temple sealing cancellation also exist separately from each other. So the Mormon church does not honor or recognize civil divorce. So if you have two people who got civilly married and sealed in the temple, they are together for however many years, and then after some time, they decide to get divorced. When they initiate that civil divorce, it does nothing to change the fact that they will be married in heaven in the eyes of the church. And so that, first of all, that is already very cruel, that a civil divorce is fundamentally not recognized. And I've met women, for example, who were put in the hospital because their husband was abusive, and they divorced them. And despite multiple requests to the church will not cancel the sealing. And so they just kind of have to live with the knowledge that they will be eternally connected to that man, their abuser, in the afterlife for forever. And so we see a doctrine that is, packaged to be very beautiful and compassionate. Families can be together forever is a song I grew up singing. It's one of the first things Mormon missionaries will talk about. We believe that through the power of the temple, you can be with your family, your spouse and your children into the afterlife. This is one of the primary selling points of Mormonism, and can be actually quite cruel when you really believe this, because keep in mind, Mormons are not just kind of like, oh, maybe this is going to happen. I believed in polygamy as much as I believed God was real. So this is not something that's just like, hopefully not. This is something that is as real as the air we breathe to Mormons. To go back to that letter really quick and to read the final sentence, it says, if at some future point you wish to be sealed to another husband, you must apply to the First Presidency for a cancellation of your sealing if you have not already done so. And so what this means is the husband never has to apply for a sealing cancellation, because he can accrue as many women as he civilly marries on planet Earth. So first woman he divorces, next woman he can get sealed to, so he'll have two wives in heaven. Maybe the second woman passes away, so he marries a third woman civilly. He'll be sealed to her in heaven. So the man can just collect women like Pokemon cards. But if her husband passes away, and they were married in the temple, before she can get resealed to man number two, if she finds another man to fall in love with, before she can get sealed to him in the temple, she has to cancel that sealing to that first man. So she can't accrue husbands like Pokemon cards. She is a single unit. She can only have one bond, essentially. And so in a lot of cases where a woman was married to someone who was abusive or horrible to her, the only way that she can get that sealing cancellation is if she finds a new man to become a trading card for. She has to find a new man to essentially take her on before the First Presidency and before the church is usually and typically in almost every situation willing to grant a cancellation of sealing. And so she basically becomes the property. When you get married in the temple, you basically become your husband's property. He's acquired you. You're linked to him for all eternity. And the only way to unlink yourself from him is to find a new man to link yourself to. You're basically never going to be a free agent again in the Mormon church once you've agreed to a temple sealing, because they will not allow you to just unseal yourself, because you ask for it, because you got divorced, because he abused you. You're going to be connected to him. So, if you find out your husband's going to get sealed or married to a second woman, even that is not enough to say, I don't want to be a sister wife in heaven. You basically have have to find another worthy Mormon man to take you on, and that will cancel the sealing from that first husband. But like I said, you do not have to take my word for this. It is in the official church handbook, which you can see here. As I said, this is specifically a handbook meant for bishops and stake presidents. I think reading through this handbook is also just kind of a crazy ride. They talk about so many different scenarios that you might not even assume the church has some sort of policy or stance on. For example, they have a section about who can observe the sealings in the temple of living brothers and sisters, what to do for children who are not born into the covenant or with parents who are already sealed, what to do with adopted or foster children who are living, what to do with children conceived by artificial insemination or in vitro. They have the sealing of a living parent to one natural parent and a step parent. So they've basically gone through to cover every single scenario of how families can be together forever temple marriage might play out, and what the church's stance is on every single individual way that families might come together. Because keep in mind, there are so many different ways a family is formed. There's divorce, there's separation, there's in vitro fertilization, there's fostering, there's step parents. All of these things mean that this idea of eternal families becomes increasingly complicated the more that families are put together in non-traditional ways that don't include a nuclear family. While in this video I'm going to focus on how women are expected to accept the doctrine of being a sister wife, I do have this other Patreon video that's already posted where I go through some of the more specific scenarios, because I really just fell down a rabbit hole reading through this section of the church handbook. It's already posted on Patreon if you want to check that out, but I didn't want to go too far to the right because it feels like really explaining a lot that is very, very specific and not quite about this eternal celestial polygamy. So if you want to check that out, feel free to check that out. But let's read specifically what it says about women who are getting sealed or married to their husbands in the temple. It says here, sealing of living members after divorce. So try to remember when I say sealing, because I know it's just a Mormon word, that it's talking about eternal marriage. So women, a living woman may be sealed to only one husband. So let's just get that out there. If she is sealed to a husband and later divorces him, she must receive a cancellation of sealing from the first presidency before she may be sealed to another man in her lifetime. And as I said, it's very difficult to get a cancellation of sealing unless you have a new worthy Mormon man to take you on. And once you have that worthy man, then you can cut off your first sealing to that first man. So that's what it says for women. A living woman may be sealed to only one husband. All right, monogamy. Okay, it's checking out, but only for women. Only women can have one husband. So men, if a husband and wife have been sealed and later divorced, the man must receive a sealing clearance from the first presidency before another woman may be sealed to him. So you notice the difference there. The woman has to get a sealing cancellation. The man has to get sealing clearance for a second wife. So that's how we get the document I showed you where it's explicitly saying, hey, just so you know, your husband is about to acquire a second wife. It goes on a little bit later to say, for example, if a man received a sealing clearance to be sealed to a second wife after a divorce and his second wife dies, he would not need a sealing clearance to be sealed again. So if this is very difficult to explain clearly, but essentially what they're saying in the official church handbook from 2019, if the man receives a sealing clearance for his second wife, so he has one wife, two wife, the second wife dies, he doesn't need to get the first wife's permission to acquire a third wife. So they are explicitly in the church handbook from 2019 explaining a scenario in which a man may acquire 3 wives and what to do if he wants to get those 3 wives. And just to revisit what I said earlier, I know you may be thinking, this just sounds so silly. It's the afterlife. I want to just really, really express that people fully believe this. People fully are going into, and I'm going to read some stories of just how much it hurts people's hearts to know that they're going to have 3 wives in heaven, that they're going to be one of 3 wives. It sounds made up. I know it sounds made up, but it is in the church handbook. Sometimes when I talk about this, I feel like people are kind of like, oh, that's so silly. Like, of course, it's just a fantasy. But imagine fully believing that, the soul is continuous, that in heaven you'll basically be the same person, just dead, you'll just be a soul. And imagine fully having to know that in some future time you will be sharing your husband. That is how Mormons feel. It's not a fantasy, it's not made up, it's not kind of like, oh, maybe. This is 100% something people are planning on and living with. And I have some stories we're gonna get to, but I feel like I just can't say that enough, because sometimes when I talk about this, I think people feel like it's made up. But for the people who believe this, it is as real as the sky is blue. Growing up, I always was kind of vaguely aware of polygamy. I don't remember the exact moment that I found out that Mormons had practiced polygamy at some point. There were always jokes, as early as, late elementary, early middle school, I'd have kids make jokes about how many moms I had, or which mom was gonna help me with my homework or make dinner that night. And, so I think that because I had people joking about it, I always knew it was kind of a thing. In high school, I started asking, did we? Did we actually practice polygamy? And I was brushed off very easily. And as someone who desperately wanted to believe the church was true, I was very open to apologistic type explanations for why polygamy existed. So a common explanation was that there was a war back around Joseph Smith's time. A lot of the men had died in that war, and the women couldn't own land. It was a sexist time. And so because of that, they needed a man to care for them and provide for them. And so polygamy was just that. It was like, in my mind, it was literally just women who had had their husbands die in war, who were picked up essentially by another righteous Mormon man who would care for them. And of course, when you read the history of polygamy, which I'm not fully going to get into because this is more about eternal celestial polygamy in modern days versus the very, very long history of polygamy. I did a video with Lindsay Hansen Park where she went more into Joseph Smith's polygamy, but for the first many decades of the church, it was all about polygamy. And we'll get into some of that history soon, but just to say that it was always kind of swirling around me as a Mormon kid. I do remember, though, the first time I found out about polygamy in heaven, and that was in high school. And I recall that there was a discussion about a man who was getting remarried in the church, and his first wife had passed away. And so he had found a new wife, and they were preparing to marry in the temple. And at that point, I was very aware of eternal marriages. And so I remember asking, which of those two is he going to be with in heaven? And I remember the male teacher explaining that he would be with both of the women, and he'd be married to both. And he kind of just said it very matter-of-factly, and I think, I was too timid at that point to ask any follow-up questions, but I really had to chew on that because I realized, okay, so in my church, in heaven, men can have two wives. And not long after that, I discovered that women can only have one. It was something that I feel like in that initial moment, I started to just extrapolate and realize that could be me too. That someday I might have to share my future husband at that point with someone else. And I feel like I almost mentally tried to just put it off, put it out of my mind. And the next time this came to a head where it was in the forefront was on my mission. On my mission, I had a companion who had been reading in the Doctrine and Covenants. In 132, there's still the doctrine of polygamy. It's still just written out where Joseph Smith's, one of his original revelations about polygamy being something God wanted early Mormons to do. And she had read that, and we were discussing it. And, she basically said, well, I'm glad, it was very limited. She kind of said what I had been spoon-fed as a young Mormon kid, which is, it was very limited. It's not really a thing anymore. And isn't that great that it's over? And I remember telling her, well, yes, it's over in this life, but not in the next. And she really had a hard time with it, as you might when you have to very first contend with the fact that, keep in mind, Mormon women are raised to look forward to marriage as basically their most important thing of their life, marriage and children, to taught that marriage is going to be the most important thing that ever happens to you, and then to have the rug pull of, but you'll have to share that man with another woman probably, it's a gut punch. And I've seen it multiple times where women have realized or been taught that in the afterlife they might be in a polygamous relationship, and it's incredibly distressing because you feel like you're supposed to have faith in it, but what you're essentially being told is your husband will be unfaithful to you in the afterlife, and it's sanctioned by God, and if you don't believe that that's okay, you don't have sufficient faith. And so you go from this fairy tale version of princess and prince riding off into the sunset, your eternal true love, to realizing like if you die and your husband remarries, you're going to be a sister wife in heaven. At that point on my mission, she actually ended up speaking to a wife of someone in leadership because it was almost like so distressing to her that I feel like she was losing her faith a little bit. And I mean, that's just was my perception, but I feel like at the time I was very resigned to it. By the time I told her, I was just like, well, this is the way it is. This is God's plan for us. If you have faith, then you just close your eyes and hope everything's going to be okay. But I had also already had so many years to contend with this that I think that she was just in the very beginnings of having to realize that she might have to share her husband someday. And so we talked to the wife of a leader of the church. I feel like the explanation was basically that, we are possessive as women on earth, but in the celestial kingdom, the best version of Mormon, the highest level of Mormon heaven, in the celestial kingdom, we will not be possessive anymore, and we won't mind. And that God is loving. And if you believe that God is loving and kind, then he will not make heaven something that is unhappy for you. And so the message, in my opinion, was basically like, well, in heaven you'll be happy with it, so don't worry about it now. Which, as much as that sounds cruel to say, coming from this wife of this Mormon leader, keep in mind, she has also had to make peace with this. This is what she's told herself, is that she trusts God, and so it's going to be okay. And so I don't look back at that instance and feel like she was trying to be cruel. I actually think she was trying to be as helpful as she could within this very specific context of believing in the Mormon church and Mormon doctrine. This was the most compassionate thing for her to say. I don't view that as manipulative, almost because I think that as a Mormon woman herself, she's just saying, I've also had to come to terms with the fact that I'll be sharing my husband. And this is how I've dealt with that emotionally. So hopefully what I have to share with you is helpful too. And so that's why I think I have a lot of compassion for members of the Mormon church, and why so much of my criticism is ultimately levied more toward the church and its leaders and the doctrine, because I think a lot of people who are living under the doctrine are victims. They are people who are caught in this ideology that is incredibly sexist, and they are just trying to have faith and believe in the thing that they were spoon-fed since they were children, and that their family is a part of, their ancestors were a part of. And so I just have a lot of compassion for people who are really trying to make this work because they just feel like believe this is the only way. I remember when I was first married, my husband and I talked about polygamy, and I remember wanting so badly to ask him, can you please promise me you won't get married after if I die first? I remember really considering asking him to promise me that if I died young, that he would promise me, on my grave, that he would not get sealed to another woman in the temple, so that I would know that I wouldn't be a sister wife. But I also remember feeling like it just wasn't fair for me to ask that. And that if I died, when I was 25 and he was 25, we're the same age, that the idea that I would ask him to never have another relationship for his entire life just felt impossibly cruel and unkind. And so I didn't ask him at the time. I didn't ask him to do it because I just felt like I couldn't almost respect myself if I asked him to promise that he'd never have another relationship. But I just remember feeling like it was going to burst out of my mouth. Just like I couldn't move forward until I had gotten him to promise that. And I think at the time I honestly just was like, well, like, I think I really just thought to myself, I'm just gonna have to outlive him. That was my emotional solution in that moment, was just like, I'm just gonna have to be really making sure I have, I also even remember like looking up that women live longer than men statistically. And I just was like, thank God. Because if I can outlive him and be a great wife, and then if I can outlive him, then I'm certifiably only going to be, it's just going to be him and I. I will have ensured that I will not have a sister wife, and I never have to ask him to promise to never have another relationship after me. And, it sounds crazy to explain that. It's crazy that I was about to have him sign on the dotted line, like, I promise I won't get sealed to another woman. But having to contend with the fact that you'll be sharing your husband in heaven is really, honestly, incredibly traumatic for the mind. When you're in love and you're just having to know that in some later date, he's going to be with another woman and you're supposed to be okay with it because God said so, that is traumatic. And I feel like sometimes that word gets used a lot, but I feel like being okay with your husband having infidelity is traumatic, whether it's in this life or the next. Another example of a woman that was trying to reverse engineer and like control her future as a sister wife in heaven. This happened in one of my congregations when I was growing up. This is a story that I very intimately was aware of and was watching play out. And it's almost the same thing where I was trying to figure out if I should ask my husband to promise to never get sealed to another woman, and if that was fair of me to ask. Her version of doing this was different. Basically, there was a man and woman who were married together, and she was getting older and became quite ill and was given the news that she would pass away soon. This was told often, basically as like a faith-promoting story, which is wild. She took it upon herself because of the doctrine of polygamy. Like, this is also just illustrates how real this is to people. She took it upon herself to write a list of names of single women in my congregation who she signed off and was okay with her husband marrying and getting sealed to after she passed away. And so she wrote a short list of a few names and said, these are the women I would be okay with being a sister wife with in the afterlife. So she's basically choosing her sister wife. And so the woman passes away, and her husband consults the list, asks one of those women on some dates, and they ended up getting married and sealed in the temple. It's also like such a strange love story almost, because he did what she asked, She was afraid of having to be eternally stuck with a woman she didn't like or didn't think highly of. And so in a sense, I feel like this story is very strangely sweet in like a Mormon way, where this man also believed in the doctrine of eternal celestial polygamy, and he knew he was going to get remarried after his first wife passed away, and he knew he wanted to marry a good Mormon woman and get sealed to her in the temple. In a twisted sense, it's like a kind of a beautiful story of a man honoring his wife's wishes, but it's also a very sad story, because in the last moments of her life, she's thinking about and she's planning her sister wife under this, to me, horrific doctrine that says that she's going to basically like live in the same house in heaven with his second wife. And she will be wife number one, and the other woman will be wife number two. And think of also wife number two's experience. This was a story that was passed around while the woman was alive and after she passed away, and was talked about when the marriage happened to the second wife. And it's like she's literally being discussed as the second wife in the circles of the congregation. It's kind of a wild story that she's just planning her second sister wife and giving approval to who gets to be second wife. But it also, I think, shows that every Mormon woman has to contend with this. And just like me, I want to ask him to promise my husband, promise me you'll never get sealed in the temple after I die, if I die first. For this woman, she already knew she was going to pass away, so she's planning, okay, at least let me say who who I'm going to have as a second wife. So basically every Mormon woman who is sealed in the temple has to contend with the fact that under the doctrine of Mormon teachings in the 2019 Church Handbook, she's going to have to maybe share her husband. After being indoctrinated since birth to believe that being a wife is one of the most important things she'll ever do, maybe second only to becoming a mother. Here's one of the stories from Carolyn Pearson. This is a story that was written into her, and she basically says that she begins to have a huge fear of her own death. And it says, "It was always there, that terrible anxiety. As I sifted through my fears, I came to realize the only reason for this terror is because I know that if I die, especially young, my husband will surely remarry and be sealed to another woman, and I will then face an eternity of polygamy. It's that simple. And that fear has developed to the point that I now experience a form of hypochondria." At the end of her story, she says, "I want to feel the assurance from God that my happiness, both now and eternally, is important to him, but polygamy in the next life seems like a punishment, not eternal glory." And so I feel like, obviously, between all these stories, you can see that there exists in Mormon women this quiet, lifelong anxiety that they will outlive their husbands. And it's so strange to hope so dearly that you will just outlive your husband, because that is the only way to be sure that you won't be a sister wife in heaven. And just hoping that your husband dies before you is also is a huge source of guilt. That's such a dark thing to wish for. But I also feel like, too, God as a concept is very interesting because, people say a lot of things about God. Kind of stepping back for a minute. In the church, in the Mormon church, you are taught a lot about your loving Heavenly Father. So God is a father figure. He has unconditional love. And I think God loving unconditionally and, Jesus dying on the cross, these are pretty common mainstream Christian interpretations of God. God is good, God is loving, God is just. But if you look at the scriptures, the Bible, stories in the Bible, we have a story of a man asked to kill his son, and then at the last second, the angel's like, psych! We have the story of the flood, where God kills most of the population of the planet and only saves a select few. And, so if you look at the stories in the scriptures, even in the Book of Mormon, which is obviously just a book that Mormons read, not all Christians, but there's stories of Nephi being told to kill Laban to save the gospel and save the believers, essentially. So there's stories of, hey, murder is justified, essentially. And there's just a lot of stories about God asking people to go through hardship in a way that seems really cruel. It's like God is like American Ninja Warrior God. Like, he's just really obsessed with trials and tribulations, and you have to prove yourself. And I feel like the idea that, as I'm married, I've been married for 9 years or so, and the idea that I would constantly be giving my husband tests to prove that he loves me sounds pretty toxic. Like, imagine with your kids, you're just like daily asking them to do interesting and strange little challenges so that they really prove that they respect you and honor you and love you. And so how this relates back to the polygamy thing is, I feel like when, as a Mormon woman, you are contending with polygamy, you've already been taught all these stories about God being loving, but in a kind of cruel way, and asking you to give up a lot. Give 10% of your tithing, which is what I talked about last week. Give your children for 2 years to the church to serve missions. Give fast offerings, have a calling. There's just a lot of sacrifice asked for within the Mormon church. And so when you just have one more thing, sacrifice the fidelity of your husband to another woman, it doesn't feel unnatural necessarily. It feels especially cruel in a very specific way, but it doesn't feel like it is outside of the bounds of what you've already experienced as part of your belief in God. To read a little bit more from the handbook, because I think they have a section where they kind of explain an overview of sealing policies. It says, members who have concerns about the eternal nature of the sealing ordinance and their associated family and spousal relationships can find peace in the knowledge that Heavenly Father is loving and just. To skip forward a bit, it says, members who are divorced but still sealed to the former spouse are often troubled by the thought of that sealing. I wonder why. Why would it be troubling to choose to get divorced and then know you'll still be with them in heaven? Interesting note. It says, the sealing will not be compulsory in the post-mortal life for either a man or woman. If temple covenants are broken and no repentance is made, the sealing between the husband and wife is revoked. However, those that keep their covenants will retain the individual blessings provided by the sealing. So what I find very objectionable about this little paragraph that obviously, I assume the bishop is meant to read this and then use it to counsel. If they have a divorced woman come in and say, hey, my husband used to beat me and I'm still sealed to him. The bishop is meant to use this to be able to say, well, you won't be forced to be married to him in the afterlife. Which the reason that that's so frustrating is that, but you still are sealed to him. If it's not compulsory in the afterlife, why don't you just let people break their temple sealing? That's to me why it's so frustrating. Is to me this feels like they're brushing the concern off again. They're saying, well, it won't be compulsory in the afterlife, but we still will force you to be sealed to that person on paper. You're still going to be married to them on paper, and assume and trust that in the afterlife it won't be compulsory. If it's not compulsory in the afterlife, I sure as hell don't understand why you are making it compulsory in this life. I also feel like a lot of apologist thinking goes down this same line, which is that you'll be able to choose in the next life. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about the Mormon afterlife in a bit, because understanding that will help you understand why this is such a big deal on another level, the exact conception of the Mormon afterlife. But, this is very similar to other times in the church. People are like, well, you get to choose. I get to choose whether or not I drink coffee. So the choice, though, is either choose to drink coffee and be, sent out of God's presence, essentially to hell, but they don't call it that, or you can choose to abstain from coffee, and then you'll get to be in God's presence and go to the best version of Mormon heaven. So you can choose, but your choice is between heaven and hell. It's either eternal damnation or an eternity of happiness and rewards. So, if I tell you, like, you can either choose to get $1 billion or choose $0. Like, of course, yes, it's still a choice, but the choice is so obvious that there's really only one right answer. The difference being, though, is that the choice within a Mormon context is very manipulative. You're not getting $1 billion. Essentially, you're being told you can either be sealed to your husband with a sister wife in the afterlife, or if your sealing is revoked, you can not be in the highest level of the celestial kingdom. Because to get to the highest level of Mormon heaven, you have to be married. Your salvation is dependent on you being married. They don't really explain, in my opinion, if your sealing is revoked or you decide like it's not compulsory, so you decide to not be sealed. Well, then without a sealing, you actually don't get to be in the highest level of the celestial kingdom, and you're taught that you'll be a ministering angel without a marriage. A lot of this, and this is the problem with a lot of Mormon doctrine, it's just like trying to make sense out of nonsense. So, this is ultimately a teaching that was taught by Joseph Smith in the mid-1800s. I don't think he was thinking about things like in vitro fertilization or foster children or multiple divorces. I don't think he was thinking about those things when he willy-nilly invented, this idea of eternal marriage. And so it's kind of like nonsense all the way down, because the deeper you go into questioning, like, well, if it's not a choice, are we still saved by our temple sealing because that was supposed to be a saving ordinance? The deeper you go with like, well, how is it going to happen? Like, I'm going to be in a house with them as a sister wife? Is there going to be, like, we Mormons do believe there's procreation in the afterlife. So he's going to be procreating with both of us? Will we live in the same house? Will we have two houses? The boots on the ground, like, can you explain the logistics of this afterlife to me? A lot of times they'll just say, well, it'll all work out in the end. When you can have a handbook that is so specific that it breaks down all these many different scenarios, and yet you can't be specific about what does this actually look like for me to have a sister wife? It's very thin. It feels like it just drips through your fingers like water. Like it just feels like there's nothing that they can tell you that makes you feel better about the idea of being a sister wife in heaven. I also feel like even though, they have this throwaway line of sealings will not be compulsory in the afterlife, I think just in my lived experience in the church, like the story I told about the woman writing down the names of who her husband could get sealed to, I just think people are assuming that it's gonna be real. You might say, well, it's not compulsory, but if God wants us to be polygamist in the afterlife, I'm not going to be shirking my duty. If you're a faithful Mormon, you're not seeing this as, well, you show up to the table and they're like, take it or leave it. What do you choose? You can either be sealed as a sister wife or you can be alone for eternity. I think that most people are basically acting like the sealing is going to stand and that they're really going to be with that person and with the other wife. I also feel like why it's so crazy and significant to read the doctrine in the church handbook is that if you practice polygamy, as I said at the beginning, if you practice polygamy as a Mormon, you could get excommunicated. But it still is in the Doctrine and Covenants. If you read in D&C Doctrine and Covenants 132, this is Joseph Smith giving the revelation of polygamy being ordained by God. His first wife, Emma, really didn't like it. Go figure, Usually when you get married, you kind of expect you're going to be just the one wife. And so to suddenly discover that you will be sharing is quite frustrating. And some women don't like that, surprisingly, just like men wouldn't like it and obviously don't like it because they don't allow the women to do it, which is another reason why this whole Mormon polygamy thing is so insulting, is that it's only for the men. So it's egregiously sexist. It's on its face so sexist and so one-sided. And the men never have to contend with this idea that they're going to have to share their wife. That's just not something that they have to deal with. It's something they only make the women deal with, which is inherently sexist. And so in the D&C 132, he is revealing by God's voice that they're going to do polygamy. This is God talking, but it's actually Joseph Smith saying the words. And I command mine handmaid, Emma Smith, to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. She only gets one, it's Joseph Smith. But if she will not abide this commandment, the commandment of polygamy, guess what the Lord is telling Emma is going to happen if she doesn't abide the commandment of polygamy? But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and will destroy her if she abide not in my law. And I saw a quote in this book, which is a really great book, you should check it out, which basically said, if God didn't care about Emma's feelings, why would he care about mine? I don't know how that single verse isn't just the death of the church for all women. Like, I don't know how you read that verse and see that Joseph Smith, saying God is talking, says that Emma will be destroyed if she doesn't accept polygamy. How is that not the end of it? There's so many ways to criticize the church, whether it's, the Book of Abraham or the church's stance on LGBT issues. Every video I ever make is obviously criticizing the church. But if there's one verse that doesn't just do it in for everyone, I don't see how it's not this verse that says that, if a woman doesn't accept her husband's infidelity, she'll be destroyed. And God said that. I have another very distinct memory of arguing with a missionary in the MTC. It's the Missionary Training Center, where new missionaries basically go and learn how to be missionaries before they go to all across, the different areas throughout the globe. I was talking to this elder about polygamy, and I don't even remember how it came up, but he basically said that he had a testimony of polygamy. And I was like, well, we don't practice polygamy. And he was like, well, it's still in the D&C, Doctrine and Covenants. And I was like, well, that was just for those people at that time. And he said, well, it doesn't say that in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is true. It's an eternal principle. Let me read it so that I read it specifically. Brigham Young said, only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain unto a glory that may even be permitted to come into the presence of the Father and the Son. So that's the bottom 2 rows of the celestial kingdom. But they cannot reign as kings in glory because they had blessing offered unto them and they refused to accept them. So in Mormon speak, he's essentially saying that if you want to go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom, Mormon heaven, you have to be a polygamist. And so basically what this missionary told me is that he felt like if it wasn't for the U.S. government, which made the Mormons get rid of polygamy, which is true, that the only reason they got rid of polygamy was because that was a prerequisite to them joining the United States. They were a territory before that. They promised to get rid of polygamy as part of joining the United States. And his argument was that if it wasn't for the government, Mormons would still be practicing polygamy, and that we practice it in the afterlife with temple sealings. And all of these things are evidence between the DNC and Utah giving it up for the laws of the land and polygamy in the afterlife. He's basically was like, well, we're going to have polygamy someday again as Mormons. And he literally said, I'm looking forward to it. Someday I'll have two or three wives, basically. He said, I'm looking forward to it, to polygamy coming back. And I remember also I used this Larry King Live interview because we were really arguing, because I was like a Mormon woman that was believing, here I am fighting for my life in this argument, just being like, I don't want to live in polygamy. I don't want to have to be in a polygamist relationship. Is that too much to ask of God? So I used the example of Gordon B. Hinckley talking to Larry King Live, where Gordon B. Hinckley says that polygamy is an abomination. The elder, the missionary, basically said that, well, he said that on a TV show. That's not a conference talk. He was speaking as a man, not speaking for God. Basically, in the Mormon belief, prophets aren't always held to the same standard if they're talking as a man versus talking as a prophet. And so his argument was that because he said it on a TV show, that he just did that because he's concealing and lying about this doctrine of the church that people don't like because it's sacred, basically. And I remember driving home after that shift teaching at the MTC and just feeling so upset, not because the missionary had argued with me or that I had lost the argument, but I was upset that he was right and that polygamy was still part of Mormon doctrine, and that even though I didn't want it to be, it was still in our scriptures. It was still practiced in the afterlife. And the only reason Mormons got rid of polygamy was to join the United States as a state, Utah as a state. I just remember feeling so upset because I just knew I was like, he's right. And I just feel like the idea of having to continuously accept polygamy as a thing you're going to have to live, it really just drags you down. There's so many stories I could point to that are moments where polygamy comes into play in my short Mormon experience. I left when I was 23 or 24, but it came up a lot in that 2-decade time that I was a devout member of the church. And at BYU, I recall I had a friend, and essentially the story is that there was a family member who knew someone in their congregation who had a woman who would come to their house occasionally. So basically picture 2 married people and then a woman who would visit occasionally and would play with the kids and hang out. And this woman always thought it was a bit odd. And then one day the woman sees the man and the cleaning lady, the friend, in the car together kissing. And she's like, oh my gosh, he's cheating on his wife with this woman. So she wrings her hands and she's like, I guess I'll tell the wife. I don't want to get into it. I don't want to step on any toes, but if someone's being cheated on, I feel like I should tell them. And so she finally calls up this woman and says, hey, I saw your husband in the car with that other lady, and I saw them exchange a kiss. And the woman tells her that they are polygamists and that, they are basically still in the mainstream church, but that they prayed about Doctrine and Covenants 132 And they realized that God's original church, as restored by Joseph Smith, was a polygamist church. And that because of this is very similar to the plotline of Big Love, honestly, and I think it's actually fairly common that very devout members of the Mormon church end up deciding to covertly do polygamy because it's doctrine. And there's a lot of quotes from early Mormon leaders saying you have to be a polygamist. And so in this case, she had essentially stumbled into a family that was practicing covert polygamy, but still maintaining their membership in the mainstream Mormon church. And so the woman was basically like, he's not cheating on me. We're polygamists, and I know, and she lives with us, and it's fully consensual, and basically just like, we're polygamists. And I think if you really get deep enough into Mormon doctrine, it's not a surprising conclusion. There are other stories of people being more or less, single women, being propositioned to join as a second wife. And, often Mormon men will use this as a tool to say, hey, I want to be a polygamist. Would you like to be my second wife? And you'll acquire wives in this way, even if they're mainstream Mormon, or, if they're here's a graph of all the different sects of Mormonism that came from Joseph Smith. And if you belong to any of these, polygamy is going to be an undercurrent. Obviously, the most famous of these is the FLDS, which is what Warren Jeffs was a leader of, and he had many, many wives, many underage. He's currently in federal prison. You can read about his crimes on the internet all over the place. But basically just to say that if you are Mormon, and if you know your history, there's a non-trivial chance you may end up partaking in polygamy or wondering if you should, because the wording about the doctrine of polygamy is so strong. Whether it's reading quotes from early Mormon leaders or reading in the Doctrine and Covenants, Emma will be destroyed if she does not accept polygamy. And people who are mentally trying to be as Mormon as they can and follow the doctrine as closely as they can, it's not a surprising jump to begin to be a polygamist. And even if you aren't a polygamist in this life, to have to contend with the fact that you will be a polygamist in heaven. And I think what's one of the most frustrating things talking about all this is that all of this is just invented by some dude. Joseph Smith, I think he just couldn't be faithful to his wife, so he cheated on her. I think he invented polygamy. He went through the Bible and said, here are other polygamists in the Bible, so God is okay with it. So I'm not cheating on you. I'm restoring the doctrine of polygamy as it was taught in the Bible. And he's using that as like a reverse Uno card to say, you can't be mad at me for being unfaithful to you because God actually wants me to do this. Of course, God is a man, so God also is okay with this. God doesn't mind if women are trading cards, because as long as men hold the power, well, God is a man and God holds the power. This is all just, I'm describing patriarchy. I'm describing a system invented by men for men, where men flourish and women are subservient. And that's another reason why it's so frustrating to see Mormon women and men contend with this polygamous doctrine, is that it's all made up. It's all rooted in sexism for over a century. And it's just crazy to me that people are dreaming of the afterlife where they will live in polygamy and refusing to drink coffee because coffee is a sin. And all of these things are happening in the modern day where internet access is a thing. And I think it's why there's this scene in the Barbie movie where she's first in the real world and she sees like advertisements of men and men walking in suits and men as CEOs and men on the cover of movies. And it's such a shocking thing to her, but for us, it's just the air we breathe. It's very difficult, I think, for people to deconstruct reality of like, it feels like the reality that we start in is like page 1, like is the first day of our life, and page 2, page 3. But really our lives were just dropped in and we're on page like 5058. And there's so much history that's come before us that is sculpting the reality that we're dropped into. And what's come before us in our reality is men being in power and men being in leadership and men talking to God and men saying what goes and what women should do and shouldn't do. And because of that, it can be hard to, I think, deconstruct in these moments for women. This is not God's truth. I am just on page 5,000 of a book that's been written over the course of many centuries. And this exists not because it is true, but because history has brought us to this point where men have historically been the only ones with any power. And so when I see God as the man, when I see God is telling women to be one of many sister wives, when I see God is saying women can't have the priesthood, it feels more natural than it should, purely because, you know, just because we're in 2025 doesn't mean society is perfect or developed into, you know, perfect equity and equality and egalitarianism. And so that scene from the Barbie movie definitely made me tear up a bit because, you know, if I open my phone and look at the news, who's in the news? Mostly men. And it's like getting better, but I definitely, you know, I think we are also regressing in some ways too. And so I think this is the question of eternal polygamy is just a wider part. Even like the sexism within Mormonism is just a part of a much larger system and history where men have had power and women have not. And I know I said I was going to give an explanation of the Mormon afterlife, so we've arrived to that point. This video is an even more like a deeper deep dive into the Mormon afterlife. I did this a while ago. The Mormon afterlife literally requires a flowchart to explain it. This is not just the afterlife flowchart. This is the entire path of Mormon existence. So before Earth life, there was a pre-Earth life or post, pre-immortal life. There's judgment, there's the veil, there's spirit prison and spirit paradise. So there's really so much to get into when it comes to the path that your little, if you're like a character, like a piece on a board game, the way that you go through this very long, nonsensical pre and earth life or whatever you want to call it. The God, people call it God's plan, basically. But I'm going to zero in on the final afterlife because there's actually a lot before you get to the kingdoms of heaven with judgment and everything like that. But we're going to really focus in on the afterlife of kind of where your soul will spend the rest of eternity after the judgment and second coming of Jesus Christ and all of that. This life is a test. So really all the good stuff in Mormon doctrine doesn't happen till after we die, which already is problematic because I think it means that people treat this life as almost like it's not as important. I mean, it's really not as important as what will happen in the afterlife. So it's because it's a test, it's almost like, well, the really good stuff isn't going to happen until after we die, so we're just waiting for death, which is actually quite nihilistic when you think about it. But after we're tested, after the second coming and final judgment, you end up in 3 kingdoms, which you can see here. So there is the celestial kingdom, terrestrial kingdom, and telestial kingdom. I, as an apostate, will go to the lowest kingdom. This is where apostates and adulterers go. This is where Hitler will also go. So that's the worst kingdom. Kind of Mormon hell, but you won't see hell on this flowchart. So there's not hell specifically so much as there are things that are comparable to hell, but they don't call it that. So after the telestial kingdom, we have the terrestrial kingdom, very similar, very annoying. It's also compared to the brightness of the stars, which I know the sun, which we're getting to, is not a star, but think of it that way. So if the celestial kingdom is the sun, the terrestrial kingdom is the moon, and the telestial kingdom is the stars. So it goes down in brightness and beauty as we descend down the line. If you're a good, solid person, you're a Christian, but you don't accept Mormonism, you go to that middle kingdom. So think of, maybe even like a Buddhist who's a very kind person. You're a good person, but you're not Mormon. You didn't accept all of the Mormon doctrine and gospel, so you're in that middle kingdom. So it's not the worst place. It's not the best place. You're just kind of chilling, but you're not going to be in eternal torment or anything like that. The goal of every good Mormon is to go to the celestial kingdom. And so you'll see within the graph that within the 3 levels of heaven, there are 3 additional levels within the celestial kingdom, which are like, I don't know, I think that's why everybody says Joseph Smith would be a great fantasy writer. Well, he wasn't a great fantasy writer because the Book of Mormon is boring as hell, but he did write a book, but some of the lore does go quite deep. The world building is pretty extensive. So of the 3 levels of the celestial kingdom, each is attached more or less to different ordinances. So if you're baptized as a Mormon, but you don't get any of the other levels of blessings, then you are in the outer ring. So you're in the 3rd level of the celestial kingdom. If you want to get that 2nd level, you have to do what's called the endowment. So I've done videos on that. That's where you wear the veil, the green apron, you do the handshakes, you do the chanting. That's to get to the 2nd level. But we're not to the highest yet. So to get to the highest, you have to be baptized, you have to be endowed, and to get to the highest level, you have to have the 3rd ordinance, which is marriage. So to get to the highest level of the celestial kingdom, you have to be married. Your salvation is contingent upon you being married to a righteous member of the church. Now, this causes quite a bit of consternation because in Mormon doctrine, you're essentially dependent on someone saying yes to marriage to you to go to the highest level of heaven, which really for, certain people who struggle to get married, because if this is your first day on planet Earth, you may be surprised to find out that some people struggle to find a spouse. And some people don't want a spouse, obviously. But in Mormon doctrine, people really try to get married, but not everyone finds someone to marry them. That is really stressful and frustrating to these people who feel like their salvation is dependent on getting married, but no one will marry them. Here we have a divide of what happens to men who are unmarried and women who are unmarried. So if you are a spinster, this is also basically Mormon doctrine. If you're unmarried and you go your whole life and never get married as a woman, you will be assigned a husband in heaven. They say. Here's a quote. "There is no blessing that will be denied to any faithful woman who has been true to her covenants. If by no fault of her own she fails to obtain a worthy husband in this life, she will receive all her blessings in the world to come." That's from Joseph F. Smith in 1919. So we are now getting a little bit more to the fringe of Mormon teaching, but this is what people say, is that if you're a righteous woman and no one ever married you, you never found a husband, then in the afterlife, God will probably give you to another righteous Mormon man, probably as a 2nd or 3rd or 4th or 5th wife. And I think this is also rooted in sexism, honestly. I mean, it all is, but basically women in this conception of the world don't have any power over marriage. So if a man is always asking a woman to marry him, if you never get asked as a woman, then it's out of your power because no man ever asked you, and that's not your fault. Because of that, basically, according to Mormon teaching, here's another quote, "Every righteous woman will be married eternally and will have eternal increase." They don't ever explain how that's going to work out. Am I getting a single dude? Am I going to be the 3rd wife? I don't know. In this idea of the Mormon afterlife, a common joke, there's a portion of the Book of Mormon that talks about stripling warriors. These are really righteous followers of God who are warriors in this made-up book of the Book of Mormon, and a common Mormon joke about that a woman might make in a self-deprecating kind of way is that in the afterlife, that one of the stripling warriors, that God has saved one of those stripling warriors to be in love with her and be married to her in the afterlife. And so a lot of jokes will be made about, well, my husband was just born in a different time, and once I die, God will assign me my soulmate in the afterlife. So a lot of women who don't get married are comforted with these marriage assignment stories, because Mormon leaders have said that if you don't get married in this life, but marriage is a prerequisite to being in the highest level of Mormon heaven, that God will provide a husband for you. This does not apply to men, though. So if a man is unsealed, that's his fault. in this doctrine because he didn't try hard enough, basically. So this also is why, people get married so young. This is also why Mormon men ask so many women on dates, and it's just kind of like, I just gotta find somebody. It's because you just need someone to be saved. If you want to go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom, you need to be married. It's like they're unbaptized almost, and they're like, I have to be baptized. They're looking for a wife because their salvation literally depends on it. So if a man dies without being sealed, then he will be a ministering angel. And what that means is he's kind of just the married people's bitch a little bit. He basically will have like the assignment of, I don't know, being like the lawn keeper of the people who have the polygamist house, or he'll be like the plumber that comes by, in heaven. Like he gets to be in heaven, but he won't have eternal exaltation. He won't become a god himself one day, which is a whole other thing to explain. He basically is just like the butler. He's, ministering angel is basically short for like a butler. So he gets to be in the celestial kingdom, but he's not on the track to become like God. He's basically just waiting around for everyone and helping them out on their eternal progression. Now, you may be finding yourself asking, so what's eternal progression? What exactly is happening to those people who are in the highest level of the celestial kingdom? You probably heard it in that Brigham Young quote where he said they will become like gods. Many Mormon leaders taught that eternal progression, which is also talked about in the temple, is that we will receive all the Father hath and that we will become like him. So that's why people say Mormons are crazy and that they're not monotheistic, is that part of Mormon doctrine, especially older Mormon doctrine, is that all worthy, righteous Mormons who are married in the temple and have the endowment will someday become gods themselves and will rule and reign over planets of their own. And that God, our God, I don't believe in God, but like the God that is the God of this world, was once a man on a planet long ago, and he proved himself, and then he became all-powerful and all-knowing, and then he started this set of planets on this universe. So it's very like, I always think this picture of Mormon Jesus is so funny because he's like staring at the stars, and Mormon theology is very similar to the hymn, If You Could Hie to Kolob. It talks about Kolob is the planet where God lives. It's the planet near where God lives, basically. It's all very like almost sci-fi. We're definitely getting into sci-fi territory when we talk about this part of Mormon doctrine. What is Kolob? Where is it in space? Someday Mormons will have their own planet in another universe. Basically, God was once a man. He goes and becomes perfected over time. He has a wife. Okay, so this is very important too, because God is also probably a polygamist of this God, It's a lot of gods to cover. But basically, the Mormon God, as we know it, is married. There's a heavenly mother. So here's some art that shows God as God's wife, heavenly mother. If you read between the lines about polygamy, you could draw the conclusion, depending on which quotes you're reading, that God is also a polygamist. You can see here in this criticism, this is a cartoon made by a critic of the church. God is surrounded by women who are his wives. And it kind of depends on how you slice the bread in this one. Like if you are thinking God is a polygamist, or if he's a monogamist God. If you're basing it on what Brigham Young said and a lot of other Mormon leaders, then our God, instead of singing, our God is an awesome God, you'd say he's a polygamist God, because the God of this world has multiple wives. And God and Heavenly Mother or Heavenly Mothers, their task, I know this sounds crazy. I feel like it's almost sometimes hard to make these videos because I'm like, I feel like we're getting so into like far off Mormon doctrine and theology that people never talk about in church, but like there's always maybe 20% of the ward is really into. It's hard to cover this because it's so nonsensical, but it's also like backed up by what a lot of early Mormon leaders said. So anyways, God's responsibility once he became God was to populate planet Earth. And by God having procreation with Heavenly Mother, because we have Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father, they get together. By them procreating, they created our souls. So if I'm Mormon still, I believe my soul was literally created through procreation by Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, and they made spirit babies. And those spirit babies are our souls. The reason that this matters is that if you're taking this to its logical conclusion, then it means that Heavenly Mother is constantly pregnant, because I mean, even now on the earth there's billions of people, right? So Heavenly Mother was impregnated with all of our souls and had to give birth to all of our souls. And that's why, like, I feel like the polygamy thing seems like it holds water for some people, because if you're gonna make billions of babies, it's probably helpful if you have multiple wives to populate the earth with God's spirit children. And God is spreading his spiritual seed to all of his many polygamist wives. And Heavenly Mother really doesn't get discussed much. And when you ask why we know so much about Heavenly Father but not Heavenly Mother, they'll say that Heavenly Father doesn't want mankind to be rude to her. This is literally the explanation that was the most common. This is how the conversation might go. So why don't we know more about Heavenly Mother? And why isn't she in the scriptures? Well, God loves Heavenly Mother so much. And think of how many times a day people use Heavenly Father's name in vain, and how often they curse God and are rude to God and are thankless toward God. And God wants to shield Heavenly Mother from that way of being ridiculed. And so the reason that God made sure that Heavenly Mother was never mentioned is to protect her from the scorn of her children. And so basically, we know that in order to make spirit babies, logically there must be a father in heaven and a mother in heaven, but she's just not like talked about very much, which is really probably because she's unimportant and she's just a baby making machine. But they try to dress it up that God is just really protecting her from humans being evil. For example, here's a hymn. It's called "Oh My Father." This is a Mormon hymn. And, "Oh my Father, thou that dwellest in the high and glorious place, when shall I regain thy presence?" It's kind of like a prayer that's being spoken. But in the third verse, we do get a hint. We get a Heavenly Mother mention, which is often one of the few moments where people can be like, look, we have a little bit of evidence in Mormon theology that Heavenly Mother does exist, and we haven't just imagined her out of the logic that if God is procreating, he must have a wife. It says, "In the heavens are parents single? No, the thought makes reason stare. Truth is reason, truth eternal, tells me I've a mother there." So there's our little mention of Heavenly Mother, who is eternally pregnant, pumping out the spirit babies that will populate the earth. And the reason that Heavenly Mother matters to this polygamous thing is that first, like I said, many have speculated that God is polygamist and that he has multiple wives in Mormon doctrine, and that he needed multiple wives in order to make the billions of spirits that populate the earth today. And what's more is that if the afterlife of man and woman becoming like gods, they'll also become gods with their own planets, is that we'll be following the same pattern. So if Heavenly Father is a polygamist now, and polygamy is a part of heaven, that for people to reach exaltation and to become gods themselves, they will also be polygamists, and that they will need multiple wombs in order to populate all the spirit babies for that someday to be Mormon-dominated planet and universe that will exist as a result of them becoming gods themselves. I hope that I explained that well enough in order to be followed. I think also what's worth noting is that for Mormons, heaven is a place to be productive. It's a place to become something more than you are now. You're going to be eternally progressing. I don't know if this is like the Mormon souls of the dead are going to be like in a college setting where they're taking classes on how to create animals. There's not a lot of specifics on this, but Mormon heaven is not this place where we're going to be chilling, strumming on, our little magical little instrument and singing hymns. Heaven is a place where a lot of things have to be done. You're going to be eternally progressing. You're going to be learning to become like a god yourself. And so I feel like because you're taught this way that heaven will be, you're not thinking of heaven so much as as a place that it's going to be heavenly, where it's just going to be happy. Like heaven is basically another life. And the reason this matters is that I think that when you consider polygamy as a Mormon woman, you're not thinking of heaven as the best place on earth necessarily. It's a place to become like God. That's what heaven is in Mormon theology. And so whenever I've shared this idea of heaven with people, they're like, well, that sounds really horrible. And I'm like, yeah, like Mormon heaven is really horrible for women, ironically. But as a Mormon woman, you're not thinking of heaven as a place to rest necessarily, or a place to enjoy yourself, or a place that you'll just be singing hymns. Heaven is like this life. It's going to be a daily toil of having to become like God, and there's a whole new set of objectives to reach once you get to that level of heaven. It's not like we're just done and we rest. It's that we die, we go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom, and then we're engaged in learning to become like God. So now that you understand maybe a little bit more of the theology that goes into Mormon celestial polygamy, I wanted to read some of the stories and explain some of the scenarios that might come into play if you are, like I said, boots on the ground living this doctrine versus theorizing about it on a YouTube channel. Because this doctrine of eternal celestial polygamy has very significant real world implications for the people who are expecting that someday their husband will have to have another wife and will be going between two women, and that's what heaven is going to be like. So the first person I wanted to highlight as we consider the implications is the husband, who may potentially become a polygamist if his first wife dies and he decides to get sealed to another woman, which we've been covering. So the most obvious example of this is the current Mormon prophet, President Nelson. So here he is with his first wife. He married his first wife back when they were young, typical Mormon union. She passed away and he got remarried. And the woman that he remarried, which is of significant note, she was never married. So she was completely unmarried till she was in her 50s or 60s or whatever. And the prophet comes along, comes to court her. He's not quite prophet yet. And they get married, and he gets sealed to her. And most ex-Mormons theorize that the reason he married a woman who'd just never been married before is so that he could have her be sealed to him, so that he can have two wives. So the current prophet of the church is a polygamist. He completely believes that he will be with both of these women in the afterlife. In the case of the husband, it may even be that he can have multiple wives, even if his wife doesn't die early. So if a husband is married and he chooses to get divorced, or they both choose to get divorced, then when he gets his second wife, if she's Mormon and active in the church, and he gets sealed to her, then the first wife will become a sister wife, more or less without her consent. There's a lot of stories in this book, but to highlight a couple stories that match that description, first we have this story. It says, polygamy became very real for me when my parents divorced after 30 years. My father took solace in his belief that in heaven he will not only enjoy the eternal company of his new wife, but he will also have my mother. These two wonderful women are aware of his feelings and aware that the church, which they hold dear, teaches this. It causes them both pain and has caused my father and his new wife to move far away, so she will not have to run into her sister wife at the grocery store or the post office. And so in this case, imagine you've been divorced and your ex-husband is looking you in the eye and saying, well, you can divorce me, but I'll still be with you. Like, you're still connected to me in the afterlife. This is another scenario that's somewhat similar that I found really sad. Recently, my Orthodox mother and I had a conversation that I found devastating. She said, the one thing that would cause me to lose my faith and leave the church would be if a bishop called your dad and me in and told us we had been chosen to practice polygamy. I couldn't do it. I will never do it. I said, even if you truly thought the instruction came straight from God, even then, I don't care who it came from. So she's like, even if God told me to be in a polygamous relationship, I still wouldn't do it. This shocked me because my mother had never given even a whisper of disagreeing with God or his church about anything. I asked her, Mom, what will you do in the afterlife in the celestial kingdom? What will you do when dad has been given plural wives to populate his worlds without number? So now that I've explained the Mormon afterlife to you, you can understand that concern. She replied with a sad smile, "Oh, sweetie, I won't be there." Confused, I asked, "You won't be in the celestial kingdom? You're the best woman I know. How can you say you won't be there?" "Well, I make sure that I commit little sins, nothing big, just little sins like lying and being judgmental and other things, just enough so I don't have to go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom. So I'll never have to worry about that polygamy stuff." The girl says, "Does Dad know this?" The mom responds, "Yes, we've talked about it and he understands." So you won't be with Dad in heaven?" Sadly, Mom shook her head and said, "I just try not to think of it too much." That's so awful. And so I've shared multiple ways Mormon women have contended with polygamy in heaven. I'm thinking maybe I should have my husband promise to never get married after me. One woman is writing down the list of names of women she's comfortable with. This woman is committing small sins to make sure she doesn't go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom, so she doesn't even have to ever contend with the idea of being in a polygamous relationship. So every woman who has to contend with what she's going to do, because this is a real chance for almost every Mormon woman. Another situation that is common that I wanted to highlight is the Mormon widow who has been sealed, but her husband has passed away. And this is also very common. So say two people are married, they're sealed in the temple, the husband passes away, and now the woman is faced with this question. This is what she has to decide. She can find new love that's Mormon, because of course she'll want to marry a Mormon and live with an active member of the church. And she can either tell him, "I love you, but I can't be sealed to you because I've already been sealed." And most men don't accept that. There's a good body of evidence that there are lots of men who, if they meet a woman who's already been sealed, they will just not date them. Because keep in mind, that man has to be sealed in the temple to be to the highest level of the celestial kingdom. So if a single man meets a divorced or widowed woman who's already been sealed, who's not willing to break that sealing, if he decides to marry her, he will not be saved in the highest level of the celestial kingdom. He will be a ministering angel. He'll be a butler, like I said. So Mormon widows are often total pariahs because no one wants to date them because they can't get their celestial sealing to that woman unless she's willing to break that sealing. In the cases where a widow is willing to break the sealing that she had to her previous husband, she is essentially committing him to an eternity of being a butler. Because keep in mind, without that temple sealing, he can't be in the celestial kingdom forever. He will not be exalted. So if she chooses to break that temple sealing, she's making it so that he's going to be a butler in heaven. He's going to be a ministering angel. And here's a story from the book of where a woman chose to do that. She broke the sealing to her dead husband and the family's reaction. "When I made the very difficult decision with the blessing of my adult children to cancel the sealing to my late first husband so I could be sealed to my second husband, whom I also love dearly, I had to pay a very, very high price. It has cost me a 45-year happy relationship with my husband's family. They literally disowned me. If we have a family baptism or baby blessing, they will come to the church, but they won't come to the lunch or dinner after if I will be there. They took my name off all the family lists. Many of them do not even speak to me anymore." So why are they so mad? They're mad because when she broke that sealing, she made him a ministering angel in the afterlife. And that means that he is eternally disconnected from the family because she divorced him in the afterlife, basically. So he's now a ministering angel. It should not have to be this way. My deepest wish is that these policies might change, that someday other women will not have to bear the burden of choosing between two righteous men, one who has passed on and one who shares the journey here. Men do not have to choose, only women do. I do not believe God works this way. So that's another scenario where the family is angry and she has to choose between almost like bringing upon her late husband eternal damnation or banishing him from the possibility of being close to God as possible, and having a love of her life who is with her on earth, who she wants to enjoy life with and get sealed to, because he wants to not be a butler in the afterlife too. So women have to choose, men do not. There's even this, which was a screenshot I saw on the ex-Mormon subreddit of a woman putting on her dating profile that she's already been sealed. She's not available to be sealed, but she's still hopeful to find a companion for this life. And how horrible is it that she's having to put this up front, because, like I said, a lot of Mormon men, if they're unsealed, they will not date a sealed woman because they need that exaltation and they need a woman to get them there who's unsealed. And so women obviously are literally putting it in their dating profiles because they know so many men will reject them. It's almost like anyone who puts anything undesirable up on the front of their dating profile to be like, hey, just so you know, I'm XYZ, and that's why some people don't like me, just to weed out the people who are gonna reject them on the basis of that undesirable thing. And so she's putting it out there so that people don't swipe on her and then ghost her later for realizing she's already been sealed. There's also the case where a divorced Mormon man will marry a non-Mormon woman. I've heard of stories where a Mormon man is sealed to a woman, right? Okay, we've established that. They get divorced. The Mormon man meets a non-Mormon woman who, this could happen really with either gender, but the Mormon man meets a non-Mormon woman, they fall in love, they get married civilly. She knows he's Mormon, she reads a little bit about the doctrine, and she comes to realize that he, in his head, is still eternally married to his ex-wife and not to her. And that makes her upset because of course it does, because she knows that he is banking on the ex-wife for his salvation, and that even if he's having some companionship for this life, that in the next life he's really betting on his first wife as being his get into heaven card, and he won't be with his, civilly married wife that's not a Mormon because of the way Mormon heaven works, because they're not married in the temple. Another scenario, which is also very cruel, is the case of what happens with the kids in divorce, because the kids can only be sealed to one, father, mother, man, woman combo or whatever. And so unfortunately, if two people are married and they get married in the temple, and then say the woman goes along and has kids with a second man, those kids under Mormon doctrine will not be sealed to their biological father. They will be sealed to the original union of the first man that the sealing happened under. There's also a story about that in this book. It says, I am in the bishopric in my ward of congregation. One of our members is a man who is completely inactive because his wife is sealed to her former husband. And in the eyes of the church, the two children he had with his wife are sealed to the former husband whom they both dislike. This has been a painful thorn for them. The daughter has realized that she is not sealed to her father, but to this man she doesn't even know, and she brings this up often in the young women's organization. No one has an answer. It is so frustrating to me that as a leader that this policy has changed entire lives for the worse and driven these good people from the church. I pray for a change that would ease the minds of so many people. Like I said, in this case, the eternal gospel teaching is that the kids are going to go with the sealing. So they'll go with the first husband, not with the biological father, which, what God is doing this to people, but obviously people believe it. And so that's why it's so hurtful, because they are caught in this belief that they are eternally consigned to having their kids go with another man in the afterlife. Now, I've been saving this as the kicker for the end here because I feel like this is just driving the thorn in further. But as I've shared in the past, they do sealings and baptisms for the dead in the church. So in a temple, if, say you join the church and you want your parents to have a Mormon baptism and to be sealed for time and all eternity in the temple, you can do that. So basically you can retroactively make people Mormon. They say that in the afterlife, people can choose if they want to accept or reject the Mormon baptism. But there is a policy around sealing for women who had multiple marriages in this life. And I feel like this is another reason why I think this is so cruel. This is from the church handbook. It says, deceased women. A deceased woman may be sealed to all the men whom she was legally married to during her life. So in the afterlife, and same with deceased men, a deceased man may be sealed to all the women whom he was legally married to during his lifetime. So essentially, in this life, for the women who are living and breathing the air today, they can only be sealed to one man. However, in Mormon doctrine, if the woman had passed away, the doctrine changes, and the church will seal her to all the men who she was married to in this lifetime. And so what this means is that for people who lived in the 1800s or 1500s or whatever, if a woman had multiple husbands, the church will allow her to have polygamy in heaven. But only if she's dead can she have the peace of mind of just being sealed to all of them. But for women who are living, they have to live with the idea that they don't, like the letter I read at the beginning, that they're going to be a sister wife, and that they cannot have sealings to multiple men, but they can only be sealed to one man. And so what I find so insulting and so frustrating is that if you can do it for women who have deceased, which is to allow them to be sealed to all their husbands, why can you not do it for women who are living? It just feels like a way to control them. It just feels like a way to beat them down and say that you can only be received once. You can only be a polygamist wife for one man, and he gets to have as many as he wants. And so if God lets deceased women be sealed to all their husbands who ever lived, why not allow that to happen to women too? I truly don't understand. I mean, it's just cruel at that point. It's just a tool for control that the church gets to decide who the woman is going to be with or who they won't be with. There are some scenarios that I didn't get to in this video. Like I said, I have another video on Patreon where I go into some of the more specific things that it talks about in the church handbook as far as who gets sealed to who and all these different scenarios between fostering and adopting and in vitro and divorce and step parents. So I'm going to read through more of the handbook. It's already posted if you want to go check it out. If you want to continue the party over there, you can find that video on Patreon. Otherwise, thank you for joining me in my explanation of polygamy, celestial polygamy in heaven. This is one of the things that anytime I've ever talked about this to people who aren't Mormon, they're always just like their jaw just continues to drop, just like, what church is this again? So consider checking out this book. I feel like if you want to read more personal stories of all of the stories she collected from members from her. She did just like a blind survey of people. Or if you want to read, she has her story interwoven amongst all of the personal accounts. So I definitely recommend checking out that book. I feel like if you're someone who's coming and watching this as someone who is personally concerned about polygamy in heaven because you're a member of the church and you are freaked out by this, I really just would say, consider what kind of God is forcing this upon women, what kind of church is forcing this upon women, who's asking women to choose between men in this way, to be single for the rest of their lives because they've already been sealed once and no one else will have them. This is obviously just an incredibly cruel doctrine that is very lopsided and gives men the power to accrue as many women as they can, like trading cards, and turns women into the trading cards. I obviously already have shown what I believe about the church, but I have a lot of sympathy and compassion for anyone who's trying to make sense of what this doctrine means for their lives personally and how it's going to play out for them in the afterlife. And I have compassion for you. I think being driven to make a list of approved women right before you die so that you don't dislike your sister wife, I think that those are scenarios that are only happening because this crazy doctrine invented by Joseph Smith to cover the fact that he wanted to cheat on Emma. That's the only reason we still have to have this doctrine, is because Joseph Smith wanted to be unfaithful to Emma. And so he invented this as a way to say God asked him to do it. If that's the doctrine that is making you have these crazy thoughts about being a polygamist in heaven, I would just say there's light on the other side of the tunnel, and just because you were taught it was true doesn't mean it is. Anyways, I hope that this video was helpful to elevate the voices of the women who are experiencing this doctrine on the front lines. And I hope you all enjoyed this video, enjoyed learning from this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing, liking this video, drop a comment, consider checking out the Patreon video. There's so many even more scenarios that I feel like I didn't even get to, just because there's so many ways in which a family can come together and evolve over time. And this doctrine, which really only complements the nuclear family, does not lend itself to families that change in any way outside of the very traditional conception of the nuclear family, which is why it's a doctrine that doesn't work. It just doesn't work for people. So if you are in the process of leaving the church, consider checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church. This book is a lot more specifically targeted to help and be a helpful voice to anyone who is in the process of leaving the church. It's a lot more about stuff like how I tried my first cup of coffee, how I navigated gender roles with my husband, coming out of this very traditional church, how to order a cocktail for the first time, lots of different things. So I tried to put everything I ever learned about leaving the church in this book. If you're in the process of leaving, consider checking it out, and I will see you all next week.